Thanks for joining our YouTube channel. If you haven't done so already, please click that subscribe button to join our community. That way you can get updated on each week's messages. With that being said, we pray that this message encourages and inspires you to take one step closer to Jesus.
So probably most of you are from our church, and so you're familiar. If you're not, you are familiar with Dr. Turek. I also travel as an apologist some, but nowhere near the degree or the expertise that Dr. Turek brings to the table. In fact, I played a golf tournament this past weekend with somebody that is really, really good. And I was telling Dr. Turek in the car yesterday, I use the word we lightly, we shot 8 under in golf. But we used about 3 or 4 of my balls the entire round. Because it was the best ball thing, and it was all his balls. He's really the professional. I was just there, and I could get it in the hole, but it's going to take me 6 shots. It took him 3. That's what I'm doing here with Dr. Turek. He's going to get it a hole in 3. I'll get it there in 6. But really excited to share this moment with him and answer any questions that you have.
Yeah, to show you how good I am at golf, I had to have my ball retriever regripped. That's the club I use the most.
Somebody asked me this question a minute ago. I'll start with asking you a question. They asked me when we were walking up. I've answered this a lot of times in my apologetic group, different types of questions like this. But aliens in the gospel. So if aliens do exist, Dr. Turek, how does that affect the gospel? I know you're not coming from a charismatic disposition necessarily, but some people would argue that aliens are ultimately a demonic thing going on. What is your stance on that? What is aliens in the gospel? We do find aliens. How does that affect us?
I don't have a firm stance on that, but my friend Hugh Ross, who is the astrophysicist I was telling you about earlier, you know about you? Yeah, he thinks it is demonic, some of these UFOs. Of course, UFO is unidentified flying objects, so I don't know what it is because it's unidentified, right? But it could be alien, although I don't know if you've heard this, that in May of 1947, there was a verified, what appeared to be crash landing of some kind of spacecraft in Area 51, and then 9 months to the day later, Al Gore was born. Anyway.
And then he invented the internet.
And then he invented the internet right after that, yeah.
We have our first question.
Yes, ma'am.
My name is Chris.
Hey, Chris.
18 months ago, I've always been a faithful voter, but 18 months ago, I became a precinct leader and became very involved, and in this last campaign, very involved. We have a culture that is stealing our children. My concern is Christians aren't voting. Our turnout was 25%. Primary.
You're absolutely
and
right.
I'm just, I know politics isn't the answer, but it is one of the tools that we have.
Exactly.
And I'm distressed about it.
Look, I was just I spoke at a conference at TPUSA, Charlie Kirk's organization, out in San Diego a couple weeks ago. I was one of the speakers, but David Barton was there too. You guys know who David Barton is? And David Barton made the interesting point, he's echoing your point, that when you do the math, I think maybe, I don't have the numbers exactly memorized, but it was something like 65% of voters, eligible voters are registered, and of course fewer than them actually vote. And he did the math and he said about 36% of voters who could vote, which means, since you only have to win about half of the vote, 18% of Americans choose the president. I mean, think about that. Less than 1 out of 5 Americans who could choose the president really do choose the president. And obviously, the race is down ballot. And so if the church could just get their people to do 2 things, number 1, to vote, and number 2, to vote biblically, a lot of the political problems that we have would go away. And yet, for some reason, Christians don't do vote. And there's a number of reasons for this. It goes back to the Johnson Amendment in 1954, where Lyndon B. Johnson tried to keep the church from endorsing candidates. And a lot of Christians Even pastors believe you can't speak about anything political from the pulpit, which is nonsense. This country began by the Black Robe Regiment, which were basically pastors who were saying that we're being treated unfairly by King George, and so we need to break away. If it wasn't for the pastors, there wouldn't be an America, at least not one that was founded back in 1776. But secondly, if you don't think politics are important, I always hear people say, a lot of pastors will say, well, I just preach the gospel. I have two things to say to people like that. God, number one, instituted 3 institutions. He started 3 institutions: family, government, and church, in that order. Don't be only 2/3 of a pastor. In other words, you're just dealing with family and church, and you're forgetting government. And Paul, of course, says in Romans 13 that the ruler is in place to prevent innocent people from suffering. He's going to bring the sword to bear on people who are guilty. That's the number one role of government, to prevent innocent people from getting hurt. And when Christians don't get involved in government, then the conscience of the nation goes away, and we have now the government not only not preventing evil, encouraging evil. And whose fault is that? It's our fault. And the second thing I like to say to pastors, oh, you're just preaching the gospel? Try to go to North Korea and do that. Try and go to Saudi Arabia and do that. Try to go to Iran and do that. Just preach the gospel, see how far you get. We forget in this country our very ability to preach and live the gospel depends on political freedom. If you don't have political freedom, you can't preach and live the gospel. Not legally anyway. And probably the fastest way to show people that Christians have to be at least engaged to a certain extent in politics is I ask them to take out their iPhone or their Droid or whatever, and I asked them to go Google 3 words: Korea satellite night. And if you Google, you could do it right now. Google those 3 words, Korea satellite night, and look at images. What are you going to see? You're going to see a satellite image of the Korean peninsula. And on the bottom of Korea, South Korea, you'll see a nation full of light and productivity. North Korea, right over the 38th parallel, you'll see a little speck of light from their capital. The rest of the country is dark. South Korea is a thriving democracy. They have food, they have electricity, they have opportunity, they have freedom. North Korea, on the other hand, is a concentration camp. And there's one reason for the difference between South and North Korea. Homogeneous group of Koreans. What's the major difference between the North and the South? Politics. The South has political freedom, the North does not. And so I say, if you're interested in the gospel, as we all are, you better be interested in politics, because you can't do the gospel unless you have political freedom, at least not freely anyway.
And righteousness is being bullied right now, and for me, this is where I'm drawing the line.
Yeah.
I don't care what my neighbors think. I mean, I love them, but I'm drawing the line for the kids and everything.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, Jesus said, occupy till I come.
Can I reply to that a little bit too? I'll be writing about this in my dissertation in my book coming out after that. King Josiah in ancient Judah is the last godly king. He turns the nation into revival. He steers them back the right direction, yet God had already prophesied it's too late. Destruction's coming. And the Babylonian exile comes out of that. And in the Babylonian exile, you have these characters that are phenomenal. Daniel, who we now call Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I think it's Ezekiel was one of them. And you get these people that in the midst of the darkest times where everybody was against them, still stood by their faith. Daniel's praying multiple times a day up against persecution. They're refusing to eat the king's meat, all these things that you know their stories. And they're refusing to do that in this Babylon. Well, we're part of what's now being referred to as a digital Babylon. Where did those young Hebrew boys get the grit, the tenacity, the character, the discipline, discipleship to actually hold to their faith when they went into that foreign land? That eventually is what brought it all back out. It really, in my opinion, starts with the revival of Josiah, because if you do the semiotics of Scripture, what you'll find is that Josiah is now a celebrity by the time that these young Hebrew boys, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Ezekiel, are coming up. And so now we've had a revival that's happened, that now you've disciplined a young generation to want to be like that, to change, so that when they're sent into exile, can actually handle the exile and actually carry what we would now call the gospel with them into exile. And so it's a different way of answering that same question, but I think we have to be people that are purposely raising up the next generation to handle exile, whatever that means to you. I mean, I've had long podcasts where we've talked about, can America even be saved at this point as far as where we are. Either way you look at it, it's not hard to go, hard times are coming. You don't have to be a prophet to figure that out. You have to be people as adults in this room who are raising up a generation that are so committed to Christ and the gospel that no matter what persecution comes their way, they can stand up for the Lord. And we have an example of that. So we need to be a Josiah to our kids and grandkids so that they can handle the persecution that's coming. And God will use that for his glory, as we saw in Scripture.
We were talking about Jeremiah 29 earlier, about Jeremiah 29:11, how that promise does not apply to us. Nevertheless, the principle in Jeremiah 29 does apply to us. What was one of the principles that was stated? In fact, you just brought that up there, Brent. He says in Jeremiah 29:11 to the exiles who went to Babylon, seek the welfare of the nation you are in. Seek the welfare of the nation. They're in exile. Seek the welfare. Why? Because you love those people there, and it's going to help you as well. We have to seek the welfare of our own nation, too. Seek the welfare. That principle does apply. The promise doesn't apply. He's not saying we're going to get riches 70 years from now, but the principle he told them applies to us. We should seek the welfare of the nation we're in.
My question is for Dr. Turek. First of all, thank you so much for all the work you do, especially for my generation. My question is, if God can foresee the entire future, why would he create laws and rules for a specific society, also known as the Old Testament, and then change that? And then with that in mind, Deuteronomy 24:16 says that if no man should die for his brother's sins, then why Jesus died for us? Thank you.
Okay, state the first part of that again, if you would.
Yeah, so
if he knows the future.
if he can foresee the entire future, why would a specific society, the Jewish people, for the Old Testament, have some specific laws, but then us in the New Testament have some different laws?
Okay, why do we have an Old Covenant and New Covenant? Because God is operating with a specific group of people to bless the entire world, and he operated through the Jews initially, not because they were great. He actually says in the scriptures, you were the least of all nations, but I wanted to show my glory through you. So he did. And there are laws in the Old Testament that do not apply to us anymore. It's called the Old Covenant. And that Old Covenant was in place just for a specific time to get the promised people in the promised land to ultimately bring forth the promised Messiah, who would then bless the entire world, as even prophesied to Abraham, and beginning in Genesis chapter 12. The whole world is going to be blessed through you, Abraham. And people say, well, God's commands never change. That's not true. God's commands change all the time. But the value behind the command doesn't change. And this is true in our own experience. For example, when we have young kids, we might say to the young kid, hey, stay out of the street. Why? Because we love the kid. We don't want the kid to get hurt. But what happens when they turn about 16? We say, hey, get out in the street and get a job, right? The command changes, but the value behind the command is the same. We love our kids, and we know when the situation changes, we need to alter the command in order to achieve the desired result. God does the same thing. There are many commands in the Old Testament that no longer apply, but there are many commands that still do, and God repeats them in the New Testament. So God is bringing people along who are free creatures, and he has to work through them and get them from where they are to where he wants them to be. And so he has this track to run on, this Old Covenant that no longer applies to us. It only applied to ancient Israel at the time. Now, this new covenant we are under, and it has some of the same laws, but also many of the laws of the Old Testament are now obsolete. As the writer of Hebrews says, Hebrews 8:13, the Old Covenant's obsolete.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hey, how you doing?
Good. You guys can both answer, but I wanted to say to Frank, I've been following you for years. I have had your app for years. I've been probably saw and listened to almost everything you've done. And one thing I've noticed that you don't really talk about, which is, in my opinion, as a Christian, one of the most complicated books in the Bible, is the book of Revelation.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, why don't you ever bring that up And how can you use apologetics to sort of defend that when it's kind of the most comprehensive and craziest thing to explain to people who aren't Christian?
You know, it's interesting you bring that up because personally, my family and I have been going through a study of the book of Revelation, and to be honest with you, we could not find one pastor that went through the book of Revelation verse by verse. What we would find, and I know why, I couldn't do it, because it's so complicated and there are so many different views of it, views that could be true, that it's more done in seminary than it is from the pulpit, because it's too difficult to do all of this from the pulpit. You don't have the kind of time nor the ability to unpack all the different scenarios in Revelation. So I'd listen to some preachers that I respect highly, and they would read the passage in Revelation, and then they go off tooling off on their own. They'd pull one phrase out of it, and they wouldn't address the issue. The reason I don't take a firm stand on eschatology is because I'm on the welcoming committee, not the planning committee. All right? There are people I know who are far smarter than me. They know Greek and Hebrew, and they come to different conclusions on certain passages in Revelation. And so I just know that when we come back, when Jesus comes back, we're going to win. And I just rest in that. I know people that take a dispensational view and take other views, and I say you could be right. I don't know what the right answer is, so I don't take a firm position. It's not an issue of salvation to me. I don't know what your view is on that.
Yeah, I would be very similar. I think the reason why it's not probably talked about as much is because if you get 10 different theologians in a room, you're going to get 10 different readings of what it's saying. Mm-hmm. So much of it is metaphorical. Once you get past the churches, which is what pastors do preach on, we've done it here, and I'm sure that's what you do here all the time in the different churches. It's trying to figure out what it means, and you get all kinds of things. I would recommend, both of us have a mutual friend, Dr. Michael Brown. Mm-hmm. He wrote a book, I'm Not Afraid of the Antichrist, probably touches that some. He would probably talk about that a lot more. He's a true theologian. Locally here, Dr. Robbie Waddell, who teaches at Southeastern, did his dissertation on Revelation. He's taught at our church several times on the book, and he can be great, but his views and Dr. Brown's are going to be different. There's also Dr. Melissa Archer, who also used to teach at Southeastern. She also did her dissertation on Revelation. She's just recently moved to Tennessee. She teaches for our School of Ministry. So does Dr. Robbie Waddell. For the record, anybody want to jump into ASOM? So you can find people who are scholars on Revelation, and that's what I would recommend.
There is a book. Do you have that book, The Four Views on Revelation, by, I think it's Steve Gregg. I want to say it's Gregg, where they go through the entire book, and they have the four main views, the historical view, the futurist view, the allegorical view. They're all lined up, and they give you kind of the gist of what theologians who take each of those views say. So that might be an interesting way to look at it. But one of the problems is that of all the books in the New Testament, the book of Revelation is based, 2/3 of it, maybe more, is based on references to the Old Testament, even though they're not direct quotes. And so in order to preach through Revelation, you not only have to give the context of Revelation, you have to give the context of, say, Ezekiel, where the concept is taken from. Which,
in the context of when it was written,
yeah,
because like the beast and all that is Herod in a lot of people's views, and the mark was the gold on the coins and things. And
it's fascinating, but it's just hard to do from the pulpit. Yeah. There is a guy who looks into it quite a bit, and that's Michael Heiser. You know who Michael Heiser is? Naked Bible Podcast. He's going through the book of Revelation now, and he's going through it verse by verse and how the book of Revelation uses the Old Testament. And it's pretty academic. You can get lost in the weeds, but it sure is interesting.
So you said Michael Heisner, Michael Brown?
Michael Heiser, Michael Brown.
Right.
Michael Brown is up in near where I live in Charlotte, great guy. His probably most famous work is a prophecy in the Old Testament. He's a Messianic Jew. And if you go to onemessiah.com, or realmessiah.com, you can see a lot of his work there.
Ask Dr. Brown.
Or askdrbrown.org, yeah.
Okay,
Michael Heiser, Naked Bible Podcast.
Thank you very much.
That's why Revelation is one of the last books to be canonized.
Yeah. All right, thank you. Yes, ma'am.
First, what's that Navy thing again about the volunteer?
Never again volunteer yourself.
Thank you. I have an Army son and a Navy son. I've been involved in apologetics for decades, and Mormons are my specialty. I know their theology inside and out. What I would like to know is, when you're dealing with their concept of God, which I've told Mormon missionaries, your God's too small. I can't possibly believe what you believe. What kinds of refutation or comments would you make on their type of God to be able to get them to think and question?
Well, I once had a dinner with a Mormon when I was doing some work for myself. I was doing training for companies, and he was a Mormon president of a bank, and we had dinner one day, and I started talking about the cosmological argument we talked about earlier today, that space, matter, and time had a beginning. Whatever created space, matter, and time must transcend space, matter, and time, must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal, and intelligent. And as you know, Mormons believe as man is, God once was. They believe that the God of this universe was once a man and kind of grew up and got his own world. And if you are a Mormon man and a good Mormon man, one day you'll grow up and be a God of your own world. I'm not making this up, okay? And this is, they're polytheists. In other words, they don't believe in just one God. Now, it doesn't mean every Mormon believes this, but this is their official doctrine. So I go through this, and I point out it's all pointing back to one spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal, intelligent creator. And the Mormon guy said to us, I said, what do you think about that? He goes, oh, we don't go back that far. You don't go back that far? I was trying to figure, but it's true. You have to work that in. One of the problems, as you know, if you're an expert on Mormonism, is Mormons are fideists, meaning they're not looking for evidence. There's not many Mormon apologists. They just say, read Moroni 10 or whatever passage it is, and if you have a burning in the bosom, you know it's true. So it's very subjective. So what do you do with people who are very subjective in what they believe? Giving them reason isn't probably going to help because they're not interested in reason. All you can do is maybe talk about some of these things, get them to think about it, and hopefully, as Paul said, some plant, some water, God brings the increase. But yeah, you're not going to reason somebody out of a faith where they don't think reason is important. All right?
I have told Mormon missionaries, sincerity is not a measure of truth.
That's right. It's not. Thank you.
Let me respond a little bit differently. And for anybody else in the room, I love what you're asking because if you're going to argue for Christianity against another religion or another thing, you really need to understand that other religion. You can't. You need to understand what they believe. I think it was Norman Geisler who once said, before you can ask them to get into your boat, you have to show them there's a hole in their boat. So you have to know their boat well enough to know there's holes in the boat so he can get out of that boat and into your boat. And so it's really helpful no matter what, whether it's Mormonism or Islam or whatever, you need to know the other religion and understand it to a degree that you can argue against it.
My question comes out of a conversation I had with an atheist friend who is everything Sam Harris. And so with the morality argument, I don't know if I haven't heard any of Sam's stuff recently, but I know at one point he was all about this sentient life, you know, as a reason not to murder, rape, genocide, all these things. I don't think that holds up. You know, there's a lot of holes in that, but they think it holds up. And it got me thinking, if to go away from those big ones like genocide, murder, and rape, to ask, well, what about in like really nuanced situations like, and so what I'm asking you is if this argument kind of holds up or where you've heard or seen about this. Let's say I don't have a car and I need a car to get a job to live. And my atheist friend has 2 cars. And I stole his car because I needed one and he has 2. It didn't really harm him in the way of like murder, rape, or genocide does, but it really helped me. Or this could happen in a lot of different scenarios with lying, stealing, cheating, things like that don't really harm somebody, but at least to the extent of sentient life and all that they say there. But how do you, so my question is, how would they arbitrate between those? Have you heard that discussion? It got me wondering, and I haven't been able to like engage that conversation.
Well, we might agree with Sam Harris that his basic view is what's moral is what causes human flourishing. And he's generally right about that, right? We ought to try and help human beings flourish. The problem in his view, though, if we're just molecular machines, he's got 2 problems. Number one, how do you know that? If you're just a molecular machine, you're assuming, on one hand, Sam Harris says we don't have free will. On the other hand, he has to have free will to even say that, right? In other words, to be sure that it's true. He's using free will to say he doesn't have free will. What? Are you freely coming to the conclusion you don't have free will, or is it just you don't have free will and physics told you that? So that's his number one problem, it seems to me. The second problem is, even if you're right that human flourishing is the standard, why is human flourishing the standard if there's no God? And which humans? All humans? Or Nazis? Should Nazi humans flourish? Or Allied human flourish? Right. Allied human beings flourish, World War II. You have no standard.
Right.
I mean, we all know we ought not harm other people unnecessarily, but that doesn't explain why we ought not harm human beings.
For sure.
He's smuggling a moral standard into his system, human flourishing or don't harm people, when he's got no standard on atheism to say that ought to be. There's no ought in atheism. There just is. There's just things happen. They ought to happen this way because there's no standard beyond humanity. There's no oughtness in their world, and yet they try and make oughts out of no oughts. That's the problem. They can know right and wrong. They can be good people. They just can't justify what good is unless God exists. As we were talking about earlier, if there's no standard, say to a football game, there's no goal to it, you can't say a touchdown is better for your team than your quarterback throwing a pick six, because you can't say this play gets us closer to the goal and this play takes us further away if there's no goal. And the same thing is true in life. You've got to have a purpose to life. And there's no purpose on atheism to say this is the right way to live and this is the wrong way to live.
For sure. And I agree definitely on the big, I guess my question was with the smaller things, and that's what I wonder what he would say to that is lying and cheating are not breaking laws necessarily of the government, and they could be done in a way that doesn't really harm.
Yeah, but why should you obey the government even if you can get away with it?
For sure, and that's what I'm saying. I think there's a ton of holes, but I'd be curious on the smaller arbitrary matters. How would they even? How does he approach that, or how do?
Well, you see, the problem is if you grant them the first premise that we ought not harm people, then he's got a standard already, and he can just ping on that standard. You ought not grant him that standard at all because he doesn't have it in an atheistic worldview.
That makes sense.
So, yeah, go ahead.
The scenario you first said, what's your friend's name?
Tristan.
This is what I would do. I would say, Tristan, can I borrow your car keys? Take them and give them to a homeless person and say, what I did, was it wrong?
That's kind of what I want to know. You're right, exactly. But yeah,
I think he would think it's wrong.
Right. It goes bigger and deeper than that, like you said, you know. But thank you.
Thanks.
All right. So first and foremost, I just want to say, Dr. Turek, love your content. I'm 22 years old. I go to the University of North Florida. Graduated with my criminal justice degree. Now I'm in grad school. And I actually was talking to someone about this while we were having lunch and stuff, is trying to navigate between the differences, and basically you have Pharisees and pagans. Let's put it bluntly. You know, there's two polar opposites in that way. And the middle of that is Jesus. So I came across this group. I think I was telling you earlier too that I didn't get the opportunity to ask this. So I was trying to find it on Cross-Examine, looking into it. You know, I've seen the videos you've done on Enoch, on different things like that. And I came across this group. At first, I thought they were maybe Jehovah's Witness. There were some gentlemen. I didn't know if they were Church of God the Mother or Mormon. I didn't know. And essentially, they touched on the topic in Revelation where it says, in chapter 3, it says, this is actually a verse that he said, the one who is victorious, I will make a pillar in the temple of my God. Never again will they leave it. I will write on them the name of my God and the name of the city of my God in the New Jerusalem, which is coming down out of heaven from God. And I will also write on them my new name. Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. And so I began to use things like in the book Tactics that you've referred to many times with Columbo and questions. And I began to ask him, you know, okay, well, what are you trying to get at? Long story short, he's like, what's the name of the Holy Spirit? And I asked him, I said, what's the name? Tell me. He's like, well, you have to come and do the study. So I tried to understand, like Pastor Brent says, you know, you need to understand other religions and what other people believe, because a lot of times what we don't realize as believers is we don't know how to explain what we believe because we don't know what we believe.
Right.
And so basically, as I was doing some research and trying to dig and find and really figure out what is this group, I came across Melchizedek. And so I don't know if you've came into encounters with people who have tried to use this scripture, try to say that there's another name for the Holy Spirit, and if you could give me any insight.
Yeah, I have not. Have you heard about them, Brent?
Not specifically, but Melchizedek, Michael Heiser that you mentioned before, is going to be the expert. He talks about Melchizedek all the time.
Okay.
Yeah, and I don't know what group this is, but it sounds like a cultish kind of group.
Yeah, if it looks like, smells like,
right,
sounds like a cult, I think it's a cult, you know. So
do you know what they call themselves?
No idea. I asked them, you know, oh, well, what's the church? Oh, it's Church of God, the only true church. And I was like, okay. Well, all right.
Anytime you start with the only,
yeah. And I was like, okay, thank you for your time. I appreciate it, you know. And ultimately coming down to in those instances, as I am learning more about apologetics and following your stuff and different things like that, is learning when to end the conversation, I think is very beneficial. So I kind of wrapped it up with them and just said, do you believe Jesus is Lord? They said yes. I said, great, same team. And I left. Like, in a way, not necessarily, but trying to navigate that. This was just one of the biggest questions where I was like, if I had the chance to ask Dr. Turek, I'd ask him. So.
Well, I think, too, as I said earlier, there are no verses in the Bible. So you need to see what the context of Revelation 3 is and read all around it and see what's being said there. And we already admitted that Revelation is notoriously difficult sometimes to get the sure meaning out of. And I think that's on purpose, as I mentioned earlier, because I don't think God wants us to pinpoint when he's coming back. He just wants us to be ready, right? When he comes back, we're going to go, man, that book was more brilliant than we thought, right? Just like all the Old Testament prophecies suddenly came to light once Jesus came, rose again, and ascended. They all went, man, now I see what Isaiah was saying. Now I see what Daniel was saying. Now I see what Micah was saying, right? So I think that's on purpose. So I would be very suspect of anybody putting their entire theology, it seems, around one verse in Revelation. They need to make a stronger case than just quoting one verse.
Gotcha. And then one more question, more so off topic that maybe everyone can kind of relate to. How would you navigate having a friend that if you asked them straight up, like, if Jesus returned right now and told you, like, hey, you know, like, everything I said was true, this is all real, and they'd still be skeptical about it. How would you navigate that? What would you tell them?
Well, I would ask them, why would you be skeptical of it? Would you, I mean, if Christianity were really true, would you become a Christian? If they hesitate or say no, it's not a head problem. It's a heart problem. I mean, I've heard atheists say, well, if Jesus showed up to me, I'd go see a psychiatrist because I thought I would have a vision. So there is no way that person wants to come to faith. They're setting the evidentiary bar way too high. And I would suspect, I don't know this, but I would suspect that they don't want Christianity to be true because they think if Christianity is true, A, they're going to have to give up something they don't want to give up, B, do something they don't want to do, or C, be held accountable one day, and they don't want that to happen.
Gotcha. All right.
So you always have to ask them if it were true, see what they say.
Yes, sir. All right, thank you so
All
much.
right. God bless. Thanks, brother.
That first part of the question, I think, on that college campus, I think you can do something that's kind of neat. Ask the person, you know, I'll give you 30 minutes, sit and explain to me what you believe. But if I'm doing that, you have to give me 30 minutes for me to sit and explain to you what I believe. And that's the way dialogue should really happen.
So my question might be a little bit more juvenile, but my question is, so Jesus Christ is the ultimate sacrifice. But in the Old Testament, we would sacrifice animals. So what is the whole purpose of sacrificing and the death of the animals?
In the Old Testament?
Yeah, or just Jesus coming back and dying on the cross.
The Old Testament animals were sacrificed as symbols of the ultimate sacrifice, Jesus, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. And even, I don't know where it says in the Old Testament, Brent, maybe you can off the top of your head, where it says the blood of bulls and goats can't take away human sin. Where is that?
I don't know specifically, but
It might be in Hebrews. Yeah, it probably is Hebrews, Nick. You're right, yeah. Because Jesus is the ultimate sacrifice. And the sacrifice is there because Jesus is infinitely just. God is infinitely just, and we're not. And so for God to remain just, he's got to punish that sin. But he doesn't want to punish us. He loves us, so he has to find an innocent substitute to punish in order for him to remain just. And so who does he punish? He punishes himself, who adds humanity to his deity, comes to earth, allows the creatures that tortured and killed him to be forgiven based on him being the sacrifice. None of us can be the sacrifice because all of us have to pay for our own sins. Jesus doesn't have to pay for his own sins. He's innocent. So his sacrifice, the sacrificial atonement, is what enables God to remain just and be the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus, as Paul says in Romans chapter 3, verse 26. So it's not an arbitrary claim when Jesus says, I am the way, the only way. He's the only way because there's no other way to reconcile infinite justice and infinite love.
Life is in the blood. We're told that in the Old and New Testament. You see strange things where the blood cries out when talking about Cain and Abel. And so because life is in the blood, it's almost a life for a life kind of thing. And that's where the sacrificial system originates in the Old Testament, that you're sacrificing a life for a life. And then in the New Testament, you have one life for all time and all lives. But as I understand it, that seems to be where it is. It's because life is in the blood and you're sacrificing the blood.
Thank you.
There's also an illustration that might help. Let's suppose that you are in town and you do something wrong. You're drinking and driving. Cop sees you, pulls you over. And this is a town where there's swift justice. They bring you right into the courtroom. You look up, and the judge is your father, your physical earthly father. And he looks down at you and he says, how do you plead? And you go, guilty. They've got the breathalyzer. They know you're guilty. You say, guilty. And, but Dad, I won't do anything wrong from here on out. I'll be perfect from here on out. I'll help old ladies across the street. I'll volunteer at the orphanage. I'll give my money to the church. I'll do all that. At that point, your dad looks down at you and says, are you still drunk? Because, first of all, you're not going to do that. And even if you could, would that erase the fact that you've already committed a crime? No. Good deeds don't cancel bad deeds. So he looks down at you and he says, okay, you're guilty. $5,000 fine or you go to jail. And you go, Dad, you know I don't have $5,000. At that point, your dad gets up, he leaves his bench, he takes off his robe, he reaches into his pocket, and he pulls out $5,000. What's the only thing you can do to be free? Take it, right? Promise of doing good works isn't going to change anything. The only way you can be free is to take the money, because if your dad is truly just, he just can't let you go. That would be unjust, right? If he just let you go, he's got to levy a fine. And so he does, but then he's the one that pays it. If you don't want it, you don't have to take it. God's not going to force freedom on you. You can go to jail if you want to, but he's giving you the opportunity to be free of that. And that's what the gospel is. God comes down from heaven, he adds humanity to his deity, and he pays the fine for us. And if you don't want it, you don't have to take it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello again. Incest is prohibited in the Bible. So why was it okay for Abraham to marry his half-sister, Sarah?
Incest in the Bible. Say that again. Why did Abraham...
Yeah, why was it okay for Abraham to marry his half-sister Sarah if incest is not allowed?
Well, incest was not allowed at a certain point. A lot of times the question comes this way: where did Cain find his wife? And I think the obvious answer is eharmony.com. I mean, where else do you get a wife? I mean, come on. Or christiantingle.com. Actually, there's nothing wrong with incest before the law, yeah, and not only before the law, but just genetically, because there were no defects early on. It was only after those defects came in, or the possibility for defects in the genome, that the law was put down, but it wasn't a problem prior to that. And by the way, the Bible traces one bloodline. It doesn't trace every bloodline. There's no way it could. It's just tracing the bloodline of the Messiah. So Genesis says that Adam and Eve had many other children. And so when people ask, where did Cain get his wife? the assumption that they're having is like, oh, well, there was only just a few people. No, there could have been many people on the earth by the time Cain got his wife, because Adam and Eve had other children, and they reproduced because there was no problem at that point. And so who knows who he married by the time he did. You gonna add something to that?
No, that was prior to the law. So your first part of the statement was about it was against the law. I believe that's what you said.
Yeah.
But that Abraham is well prior to the law. And like you said, when you have a perfect genome, you don't have to worry about the consequences of incest, which is why anything is against the law, is because it's unhealthy. Every law is that way. There's a reason somewhere that it's not good for you. That's why it's so yeah, it was not unhealthy at that point.
So it became prohibited after the law, after Abraham?
Well, when you go to Leviticus 18, where you get a list of many sexual things you ought not do, I want to say there's, I can't remember the exact number, I want to say there's 19 prohibitions in Leviticus 19, and 17 of them we still agree with as a society. There's only 2 that we don't now. I think homosexuality and maybe one other, I can't remember. What is it?
Bestiality.
Well, it might be bestiality. I don't know. I think we're still against bestiality generally, I hope. But pedophilia is on the way. Watch out. They're using the same argument the LGBTQ community was using. We were born this way. Well, look, we're all born with an orientation toward bad behavior. That doesn't prove anything, right? If you're born with anger, the anger gene, does that make gay bashing okay for you? No. Okay, so we're all born with certain problems, but that doesn't necessarily justify the behavior. So that passage in Leviticus 18 talks about what God laid down for the Israelites. Now, most of those are repeated in the New Testament. In fact, they all are. When Jesus talks, people say Jesus never spoke about homosexuality. That's not true. He did. He spoke about it in Mark chapter 7 when he said it's not what comes out of a man, or sorry, it's not what goes into a man that makes him unclean, you know, all the dietary stuff. It's what comes out of a man. And he mentions things like sexual immorality, greed, lust, all of these things, theft. Now, what did sexual immorality mean in Jesus' day?
Everything's outside of a marriage between a man and a woman.
That's right. Any kind of sexual behavior outside of the behavior of the man and the woman inside of marriage. So that included homosexuality, included premarital sex, included adultery, included bestiality, included all those things. Jesus didn't use the word homosexuality, but he talked about the category of homosexuality, or in which homosexuality was, sexual immorality. It would be like saying, well, Jesus never said anything about felony home invasion. You know, so I guess felony home invasion's okay. No, he didn't talk about felony home invasion directly, but he talked about the category known as theft, in which felony home invasion would be. Right. So it's really frustrating when you see people making these arguments. And by the way, if Jesus doesn't say something about anything, does that mean he necessarily approves it?
No.
No, of course not. So we have to know the context of the passage to figure out what's going on.
Yeah, we have the law written in our hearts.
We also do, yeah. From a natural law perspective, we know that same-sex relationships go against the natural design of the body.
Yeah. Thank you both.
Right. Thank you.
And your question about prohibition, though, there's between 500 and 1,000 years between Abraham that you're talking about and the prohibition in Leviticus and Moses. So there's a huge time difference between those two. Mm-hmm. You had a whole nation come out of it by the time you get to Leviticus. Right. That at the time was just Abraham and with Sarah.
We don't know that because a lot of us try and read through the Bible, and when we get to the book of Leviticus, we give up. Right?
Yeah, and this wasn't your specific question, but just because it's in the Bible doesn't mean it's condoned by God either. Mm-hmm. So there's plenty of stories in the Bible that was not condoned. Like you mentioned Tamar earlier. There's plenty of those stories that God didn't say, do it this way, but it's just in there as part of the history.
Yeah, it's a description, not a prescription. Yeah. There's a lot of descriptions in the Bible that are not prescriptions. Yeah, okay. The Bible describes David committing adultery with Bathsheba, but he doesn't want us to commit adultery. That's just a description. It's not a prescription. David had many wives. That's a description, not a prescription. There's a lot of descriptions in the Bible that God doesn't. In fact, the passage, it's in Romans 15 and also, I want to say, 1 Corinthians 10, where Paul writes that these stories in the Old Testament were written down to be examples to us. Mostly examples on what not to do, not examples on what to do.
Yeah. Pastor, to your point, I was confused because if I'm not mistaken, you can correct me if I'm mistaken, that God says that Sarah would be blessed and fruitful to Abraham. That's why was my question, because he's sort of condoning this behavior, and it's incest or half incest.
Yeah, God blessed Abraham and Sarah. I was just saying in general, you do get a lot of those stories.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Pretty close.
Yes, sir.
I'm curious on your question, or when you were showing that what the apostles, you believed prior to Jesus' death and then after his resurrection, and you showed the Sabbath.
Right.
You said now it's worship. So what is your thoughts about, practicing the Sabbath or having a day of rest in current generation?
Well, I think it's a good idea, but I don't think it's commanded.
Okay.
Because Paul says, don't let anyone tell you have to obey any Sabbath or festival day. And the Sabbath didn't shift to Sunday. The reason that the church started meeting on Sunday is because that's the day he rose, but it wasn't considered a Sabbath. It was the first day of the week. It was actually a work day, I should say. So the Sabbath was pointing toward Jesus, and once Jesus arrived, he became our rest, because we are justified not on what we do, we rest in what he did. So the Sabbath was just looking forward to that time. But I certainly think it's a good idea. I have friends who will turn off their iPhone and not get on the internet or have any electronics, not because it's a religious thing. They just think it's a good idea one day to not have to deal with any of that. They just shut it all off. And for them, sometimes they do it on Saturday, sometimes they do it on Sunday. And one of the reasons I think we're a lot of times theologically and biblically illiterate is because we have this distraction with us 24/7, and we never read it. We don't read anymore. We don't study anymore. We can't. We don't. It's like what did one kid with ADD said to this other kid with ADD? You don't know this? The one kid with ADD said to the other kid, "How many kids with ADD does it take to change a light bulb?" "Hey, you want to go ride bikes?" Sorry.
There's a... So we're under grace in the New Testament, which is a whole new covenant. But there are still principles from the Old Testament and Old Covenant that are very effective for life in the New Covenant. One of those principles is the Sabbath, in my opinion. That doesn't necessarily mean the Sabbath is always Saturday, but it is learning how to rest. And it's a principle for a healthy lifestyle. And there's lots of those. I mean, things like tithing that are taught in modern churches, that's a principle. It's not a law. We're not under the law. But it is a principle, and there's a lot of those that we actually take from the Old Testament and New Testament. But it's not how you get to heaven. It's not a sin not to do it. But if you're going to live the most successful life you can live, accept these principles, and the Sabbath is one of those, in my opinion.
Okay. One more question, if I can. You
That's
mentioned...
That's it. You had it.
Oh. You mentioned protecting our religious freedoms and our liberties and everything. If you kind of look back to the fall of the Roman Empire, over every 80 to 100 years, it seems like the leading society gets into a bind. They try to print their way out of their problems, and then they start dividing each other against each other. And then, like my grandparents could flee Europe and come here to the United States. They had the United States to flee to. If we can't, help, save our liberties here, do you see other regions in the world where maybe we could flee to that, our religious freedoms, could thrive in?
2 states, Florida and Texas. Yeah, I don't know. By the way, what you just mentioned there is actually a theory by a Princeton professor, Professor Howe and Strauss, I want to say. Every 80 to 100 years, there's a cycle. Is that what you were referencing?
No, it's kind of different, but the fourth turning, I'm familiar.
Okay. Yeah, there's a turnover.
Revolution every 70 years.
Yeah, something like that. And look, the church has most of its life been in exile, so we're used to living in exile. We're just not used to it here because we've been basically free in this country for so many years that we take it for granted. I mean, this is why there are some Christians saying, "Oh, don't get involved politically," as if not caring about your nation or caring about people in your nation is Christian. Why would you not care about your nation and people in your nation?
We've been in such a prosperity prosperity in the United States for the last 40 years-ish, since around the 80s, that we have come to assume that's normal for humanity. It is not normal for humanity. Through the history of humanity, you go back prior to the 80s and you find a much more difficult time, and you go back to early 1900s, and a lot of places still don't have running water or bathrooms. And so we've gotten to this place that we assume the prosperity is normal, and the actual thing is the prosperity is abnormal. And if we go back to a place that's more normal, it's actually a place of less prosperity. Now, none of us want that, but that's just the truth of world history since the creation of the world. And then I'll throw this out because this will ruffle feathers, but it'll make you think. If you want to see where the next great moves of God will happen, maybe that's not the right terminology. The next great spiritual freedom will happen. Look for the underground church. Where is it the strongest? And I know everybody wants to hate on China right now for very good reasons. For very good reasons, we want to hate on China right now, but the underground church in China is strong, and regimes topple and change like that. So we've certainly all seen that in our lifetimes, and there's no telling what God's doing in China in the next season. Don't look at tomorrow. Look at 50 years from now. And the underground church is strong there, and it's interesting just to think about what God's doing behind the scenes that we can't always see.
Yes, ma'am.
A couple questions ago, we agreed that God is a just God, and Jesus was here to fulfill that justice. And for those of us who accept the gift that he's given to us, then my question is, if we've accepted it, why do bad things still happen to us? And particularly things that don't have anything to do with our decisions or, a choice that we made.
Yeah, that's a good question. First of all, why do bad things happen to so-called good people, right? I know this is going to sound harsh, but there are no good people. There are just people that are less bad than other bad people, right? And the Bible talks about this, why do the righteous fail and the unrighteous flourish? And sometimes we don't know. We do know that one of the reasons evil exists is because free will exists, and we need free will in order to love. If you don't have free will, you can't love. But if you do have free will, you can love, but you can also do evil with it. Okay, in fact, I had a question once I was at Michigan State, and I knew there was a militant atheist in the audience because he sat through the entire 2-hour presentation looking like this. I mean, he didn't crack a smile once, and I had some pretty good jokes in there. Anyway, when it was time for Q&A, his hand shot up on this side of the room, and he said, "If there is a good God, why doesn't he stop all the evil in the world?" And I said, "Sir, that is an excellent question. Maybe because if he did, he might start with you and me, because we do evil every day." Do you ever notice that when we start complaining about evil, we always complain about somebody else? God, why didn't you stop him? Or God, why didn't you stop her? We never say, God, why didn't you stop me? Question, if God were to stop evil at midnight tonight, would you still be alive at 12:01? I wouldn't be, right? So God gives us the opportunity to love, but it also gives us the opportunity to do evil. And here's what God can't do. He can't force free creatures to do what he wants, because then they wouldn't be free. That'd be a contradiction. Now, just given the fact that we're in this space-time continuum where what you do or other people do can affect other people, and we live in an imperfect world where there are hurricanes and tornadoes and earthquakes, sometimes justice isn't going to be done completely in this world. Bad things are going to happen. And when we can't see good coming from it, that doesn't mean good isn't coming from it. In fact, I explained this at Michigan State that night, and I talked about free will, and the guy said, well, there are some things that can't be explained by free will. Like babies. Why do babies die? They didn't do anything wrong. And I said, well, first of all, from the Christian point of view, evil entered the world through a free choice. And so I know why babies die in general, because we live in a fallen world. But if you ask me, why did this particular baby die? Even when the whole church prayed that the baby wouldn't die, the baby dies anyway. I can't answer why, but I know why I can't answer. I know why I don't know why, because I'm finite, I'm inside of time, God is outside of time. He can see the end from the beginning. So there's something known as the ripple effect. You guys know what the ripple effect is? That every event that occurs, good or bad, ripples forward to affect trillions of other events and billions of people. Butterfly effect, it's sometimes called. So maybe this baby dying today, even though we can't see any good coming from it, it's going to set forth a ripple effect that 500 years from now is going to bring forth a great evangelist who saves millions of people. Can we trace all those ripples? No, we can't, but God can. God can bring good from evil even when we can't see it. In fact, you can even see it in the scriptures. In Genesis chapter 50, and before that, Joseph in the Old Testament. You remember when Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers? And he's treated poorly there. He's thrown into prison on false charges. He's really treated badly. And then I think he interprets a dream, and he rises to the number 3 in power in Egypt, and he winds up putting a bunch of grain aside. And then the very family that sold him into slavery in Egypt escapes Israel to escape a famine and to go to Egypt, where Joseph, they don't know Joseph's in power, where Joseph has grain aside that can feed them. And as soon as Joseph recognizes this is his family, what does he say to him? You dirty rat, you're going to pay for what you did to me. No, he doesn't say that. What does he say? He said, what you meant for evil, God meant for good, the saving of many lives. Here we see the ripple effect in one lifetime. The people that did evil actually caused a ripple effect to later help them when they go to Egypt. Now, most of the time we can't see it, but God can bring forth evil even when we can't see it. So the real answer is the ripple effect. That's the ripple effect. We can't always see what good is going to come from it, but God guarantees good, according to Romans 8:28, to those that love God and called according to his purpose. All things are going to work together for good to those who are going to be conformed to the image of his son. Notice he doesn't say all things are good. There's a lot of evil out there, but it's going to work together for good.
Yeah, so good, Dr. Turek. Let me also just add to it, our human nature is that we want prosperity in good times. The worst thing that happens to a Christian or individual, period, is that you become prosperous and full of good times.
That's right.
You strive for it, you long for it, but we usually can't handle it. Again, I just mentioned America since the 1980s. What changed in the 1980s? Prosperity and good times. Mm-hmm. We don't usually handle that very well. And so while we long for that, oftentimes the people that are closest to God are actually the people that are walking through the most difficult situations in life. Many of us have experienced that, right? I mean, I've heard testimonies of people that were beaten for Christ and put in prison camp type places for being Christians that talk about the nearness they felt to Christ when they're in those places, that when they're gone, when they're out of that, when they're released, they wish almost they could go back to it because there's a nearness to Christ when you're suffering. And I'm not saying that answers the question, but I do know that God wants us to be close to him. And I'm not sure God wants us to always have the easy life that we want us to have, because the easy life often leaves us away from Christ.
That's right.
Again, look at China, the house churches, the move of God that's happening there. Hard times. What's the old statement? The church popular is the church polluted. The church persecuted is the church pure. And I think we walk through hard times sometimes because God wants that closeness to him.
I think the follow-up question then is, does God allow bad things to happen, or does he orchestrate bad things to happen for good?
Yes. Well, I mean, look in the Old Testament, God brings judgment on Israel and even other nations, right? So he allows it and he orchestrates it. But it's not evil for God to kill people. I mean, people always say that, well, God killed people in the Old Testament, so isn't he for abortion? How does that follow? How does that follow? If God can do evil, or I shouldn't say that, if God can do what we consider evil, does that mean it's evil for him? I mean, think about it this way. I had a situation, it was University of Central Oklahoma. A young girl got up to the microphone and said, I can't believe in a good God because he kills people in the Old Testament. And so we went through a long discussion. I was asking her questions, and I finally asked her, I said, hey, where are you on the abortion issue? Oh, she said, I'm pro-choice. I said, can I ask you a question? Why is it that when God plays God in the Old Testament and he decides who lives and dies, he's immoral? But when you decide who lives and dies through abortion, that's a moral right. Can you justify that for me? Well, she didn't have an answer. Why? Because there is no answer. God can kill people anytime he wants because he's the creator of life and he can resurrect it anytime he wants. But just because God does something doesn't necessarily mean we can do it. Look, if Christianity's true, and it is, people don't die, they just change location. They go from this life to the next life, and it's up to God when that happens. It's not up to us. He has the authority to create and resurrect life. We don't. So I think we have to make that clear that just because God does certain things doesn't mean we are to do those same things. I mean, if God floods the earth to kill a bunch of people, do we have the right to flood the earth to kill a bunch of people? No.
Yeah, I think there's a third option, though, that you didn't say. You basically said, does God allow it or does God construct it? I think the most common answer is neither one of those. I think we construct it through our own sin, our own lifestyle, our own thing. Then we blame God on it. But the truth is, not 100% of the time, but often we make our own bad decisions, get ourselves in our own mess, and then blame God for it.
See,
it's like the Old Testament. You know, he's very clear. I just read it not that long ago. Very clear, over and over and over and over. If you obey me, these good things will happen. If you don't, these bad things will happen. God wasn't constructing the bad to come to them. He was giving an ultimatum. This is going to come because of your bad decisions. I think we do that a lot more than
this is why I would be a terrible pastor. No, really, because if people would come to me with a problem, I go, okay, tell me the problem. What's it? Well, you made all the bad decisions.
Stop it.
Yeah, stop it. It's a Bob Newhart thing. Just stop it. Stop it. Yeah. And now you want to cry on my shoulder because you sinned? You know, I mean, I have no patience for that.
I just want to throw this out there for the sake of time. There's a couple more people, but I'll defer to you guys on the time with it being what it is, but just we're all conscious of that.
Okay. God's outside of time, so he doesn't care how long we go.
Dr. Turek, I think you're a funny guy.
A funny guy?
Yeah, you tell good jokes.
Oh, well, thanks. My kids don't think so. Dad, shut up. Another dad joke.
Right. Anyway, in this culture of my truth and your truth, or my truth is not your truth, there are gay-affirming churches, gay-welcoming churches. What in your reservoir is the best scientific defense, not the biblical one, the scientific defense for same-sex attraction that is just taking over, where people are using the same my truth, your truth, cultural isms to combat us like that?
Well, I have some thoughts on it, but Brent's about to do a talk on this, so why don't you start on this one?
Oh, well, you just asked a big question. If I were debating this with somebody, and I've done this, and it's kind of funny to watch, because you'll get called a bigot and this and that. Just flip it to the next stage. Dr. Turek mentioned it a second ago. The next stage is pedophilia. NAMBLA, North American Man Boys Lovers Association, has been fighting for this for a long time. This is not new. It is the exact same argument as same-sex marriage. So if it's good for one, it has to be good for the next one. I actually wrote a blog on it. A blog might be an understatement. It's pretty long. That I've used. I can send it to you if you want it. But it walks down every one of the main premises of the homosexual argument and then flips it to pedophilia. And I'll be honest with you, I think you can make the pedophilia argument much better than you actually can the homosexual argument. Because pedophilia over the history of the world has been so much more common than homosexuality. Homosexuality has always been there. But if you count pedophilia of anybody under 18, then most of our grandparents were pedophiles. Right? And you go back into Roman times where people had harems of boys. What's his name from Gladiator? What's the not the Caesar, but the
Russell Crowe?
No, the bad guy. What's his name in history?
Nero.
Yes. No.
Commodus.
Commodus.
Oh.
Yeah, Commodus. So Commodus in the movie Gladiator, I trust most of us have seen that in this room. If you'll notice, there's this weird thing going on with him and the nephew, and it's like, the movie never really says it, but it's just kind of weird, you know, and this whole weird. So Commodus in real life had like a harem of 300 boys. And that was normal. Okay? So all I'm arguing is that pedophilia is actually much more normal historically than homosexuality has been historically. And so most people today would say, oh no, pedophilia is not absolutely off limits. Okay, it's the same argument though. So I frequently have used that tactic of just explaining, all right, well, do you agree with this? Well, then you have to agree pedophilia if you're going to go here. I would say this because I think Christians do a very poor job of this too, because the question then becomes, what is marriage? And Christians, it's like, what is a woman? People can't answer that. Well, yeah, but Christians can't answer what marriage is either very well. Generally, we're like, well, it's one man and one woman. Yeah, but what is it at its root? Let me tell you what marriage is. It's a reflection of the unity of the Trinity of God. That is at the core of what marriage is. It's the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. It's the husband, the wife, and the children. It is a reflection of the unity. It's a reflection of what God is that we get to reflect here in humanity. That's what marriage is, and we have to be able to answer what is marriage, not just what it's not. Same thing as what is a woman, so you can take it now.
With regard to same-sex attraction, two things. The twin studies show that there does not appear a genetic component to same-sex attraction. But even if there was a genetic component to same-sex attraction, that's irrelevant. Because, as I mentioned earlier, we all have a predisposition to do wrong. It's called depravity. So you wouldn't make the argument that because someone has a predisposition to gay bashing, that makes it right, okay? But secondly, I would ask people who are interested in this issue, and maybe they're on the other side of it, one question, and the question would be, if God wanted you to not engage in certain sexual activities, would you follow that command? And most of the time, the answer is no. They're just desperately trying to find a way that they can justify what they want to do. And there's two authorities that you can choose to follow, God or yourself. That's pretty much it. In fact, my friend Natasha Crane has a new book called Faithfully Different. We just had her on the podcast a couple of weeks ago. And she says the secular mind has 4 tenets to it. The first tenet is that, how does she put it? That feelings are the ultimate guide. The second is happiness is the ultimate goal. The third is that judging is the ultimate sin. And the fourth is that God is the ultimate guess. Nobody really knows if God exists, and if he does, he's unclear as to what he wants us to do. Okay? So this is the authority of the self, that feelings are my guide, I just want to be happy, and since I'm my own authority, if you're judging me, there's something wrong with you. Notice they're judging you back there. Okay, you can't tell me what to do, basically. And number 4, we don't know whether God exists or not, so don't bring God up. Now, if you just want to believe in God yourself, it gives you personal comfort, that's fine, but don't try and impose any of his values on me, because you don't know what they are anyway. Now, if you think about this, this is the way even many Christians think. That feelings are my guide, happiness is my goal, judging, you can't judge me. And you don't really know what God means by that. Now, if that's the way we're going to live, then first of all, it's self-defeating because, right, they're saying that you shouldn't judge, and yet they're judging you all the time. In fact, the podcast I just did yesterday before I came here is called Why Relativists Are Dogmatic Fundamentalists. Right? The people that say that all truth's relative, they have a list a mile long of things that they think are not relative, that they think are objectively true. They'll say, well, you can't know objective truth, yet they're listing a number of statements that they think are objectively true. Like, for example, they think same-sex marriage is a right. They think abortion is a right. They think that LGBTQ behavior is good. They think you're wrong if you think the Bible's telling the truth. They think the Bible's wrong about sexual ethics. They think Jesus isn't the only way. These are all what they think are objective truths, while at the same time they're claiming there are no objective truths. So it's completely hypocritical at the least and self-defeating in many ways. The problem is, you know what they also think? That if you use reason and evidence, you're an oppressor. So as soon as you start bringing up reason and evidence, you're trying to oppress me. That's a power play. You can't say that. And yet what are they doing? They're using reason and evidence to shut you up. Right? Now they become the oppressors. The question isn't whether or not who is an oppressor and who isn't. The question is what's true. And if they're going to say that we can't use reason and evidence, while they're using reason and evidence to say that, then they're being hypocritical. One last thing on this. The same people who say there are no objective truths are going to say, America is inherently unjust. So what are you going to ask them? Well, how do you know it's unjust? What evidence do you have that it is unjust? Well, look at what happened here, there, and there. Where are you getting that evidence from? Is that evidence objective, or is it just your subjective opinion? If it's just your subjective opinion, why should I believe it? If you're saying it's objectively true that America is unjust, number one, you have a standard. Number two, you have this evidence that you think deviates from the standard of justice, yet you're claiming there is no objective truth. So either that's objectively true, or it's not, yet you're claiming it is objectively true, and yet you claim there's no objective truth. I mean, it's completely contradictory. But people don't apparently care about contradictions. They care about their feelings. Right?
And it's a little ironic in America because we are the most tolerant nation in the history of the world by far.
Oh, yeah. And tomorrow we're going to talk about this and about following your heart. Should you follow your heart? That's what we're going to talk about tomorrow in the sermon. God has laid it on my heart, so that's what I'm going to do.
Follow your heart.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I'm not sure if you've seen it or aware of it, but in a video of one of his lectures, Jordan Peterson made the statement, "How dare one believe in God?" With then the follow-on, "If you did believe in God, then you would act as if He existed, presumably, and do all the right things." I think you touched on some of the things last night and this morning that might address it. Obviously, I have my own thoughts, but I was wondering if you could directly address that statement and how you would respond to it.
Jordan Peterson said, "How dare you believe in God?"
He said, "How dare one believe in God? Because if you truly did believe in Him, you would do all the things that God would expect you to do if you actually believed He was."
Well, I like Jordan Peterson. I don't know where he is in Christianity right now. A few years ago, he said, "I need 3 years to discover whether or not the resurrection's true." Well, he's had 3 years. He lately has seemed to be more friendly to Christianity. But, you know, the scriptures also say this: He knows we are dust. What's the psalm that says something like, if you were to keep a record of wrongs, God, I wouldn't make it, basically. Sure, we do say we believe in God, but we also say we're fallen creatures and we don't follow Him fully. None of us do. It's true, we don't. Because we are fallen, we are weak, we are sinful, we often have other priorities, but thankfully it doesn't my salvation, your salvation isn't based on our ability to do good works. Our salvation is based on His ability to live the perfect life in our place, and He's already done it. So I would agree with Jordan that it ought to compel us, out of love for what Christ has done for us, to do good works. That's Ephesians 2:10. But just because we don't doesn't mean we don't believe in God. It means we're still fallen creatures.
Yeah, that sounds to me like it might be out of context of a bigger thing he would say, because it doesn't sound like something he would normally say.
It's a pretty famous video, and he makes the point of it. To me, it seems like he mistakes belief of intellectual assent to faith and trust.
Yeah.
That's what belief is, as you mentioned last night, that even the demons say they believe. But yeah, I just was curious what your response would be. Thank you.
I've followed him quite not a lot, but I mean, I've listened to plenty of stuff from Jordan Peterson. I agree with almost everything I've ever heard.
Well, it
he's
seems
just
like
not a Christian.
Seems like he's going through a journey, and that was one of his statements, and he's
very affirming of Christianity.
Yeah.
In all kinds of ways. And I've heard that his daughter has become a Christian. I don't know if that's true, but I've heard that. So
thanks, appreciate it.
Thank you. And you know, I know he believes this, that even if Christianity isn't true, it's good for society.
Yeah, he definitely believes that.
You know, that we just need to keep this alive, because without it, we have chaos.
Where he starts talking about going to the Bible Museum, I don't know where that video would be at, but he talks about going to the Bible Museum in D.C. and how it changed him, and talks about how the Bible is the book of books, and every other book comes out of the Bible. That is a powerful, Jordan, and this is a guy who's not a believer. It's a powerful little, I don't know, quote or whatever you want to take it as, little video where he talks about that.
Hey, Heather.
So to kind of piggyback on the previous discussion, the world wants us to believe that there's scientific evidence of many different types of genders. I believe this is not based on true biological scientific facts. So I believe it represents kind of a pseudo-psychological science, that's based on emotional narcissism, where one kind of basically expects that their feelings should be absolute. So my question is, what do you think that the role of the church and Christians, Christian organizations ought to be moving forward?
Well, I think that one of the problems the church has on this issue, it's been silent. And so a lot of people who are going to church will think, the church doesn't ever talk about the issues that are really hot in the news. I guess the church doesn't have an answer to this.
I feel like we've kind of dropped the ball.
Yeah.
Recent.
I think we have, and I think if you truly love people, you'll tell them the truth in a tactful way.
Right.
And you know what I think? In fact, this came out at the Turning Point USA Pastor Summit a couple of weeks ago. One of the pastors said, your congregation is dying to know that they are not insane.
Right.
They want the pulpit to say, there's only men and women, we know that, because they've been inundated with propaganda against that for so long. But as I said earlier, it presupposes fixed genders, right?
Yeah.
Because if I'm a man and I think I'm a woman, I have to have some idea of what a man is and some idea of what a woman is to know that I have a problem.
Right.
Right? So it presupposes it on one hand. On the other hand, it tries to deny it at the same time. Now, Matt Walsh's little documentary called What's a Woman, if you ever get a chance, even you can just see clips on it. I saw a clip on it yesterday. And it's amazing the mental gymnastics some of these college professors will go through to avoid answering the question, what's a woman?
Right.
It just goes to show you the intellectual bankruptcy of it.
Denial.
And it is the, as I mentioned, the four tenets of the secular mind. Feelings are the ultimate guide, happiness is the ultimate goal, judging is the ultimate sin, and God's the ultimate guess. If feelings are my guide and I feel I'm a woman, well, then I'm a woman, because that's going to bring me happiness, we think. Now, if we truly love people, we'll point out that statistically it won't bring you happiness. We know that. Even people that have had the so-called transgender surgery, 10 years later, have a suicide rate 19 times higher than the general public. 19 times higher. There's a honeymoon period where they feel better, and then after that, it's all downhill, tragically.
Right.
Dr. Paul McHugh from Johns Hopkins University likens gender dysphoria to anorexia, where you have a mismatch between your psychology and your biology.
Right. I have a niece who suffered both from anorexia and is now gender dysphoria.
But think of the different way we treat. And so how do we treat a mismatch between the psychology and biology and anorexia? We don't affirm the anorexic in their bad thinking,
right,
their faulty thinking. We don't say to them, you're right, you're dangerously overweight, we need to get you liposuction.
Right.
We say you got to change your mind because your mind is wrong,
yes,
and we have to get you nourishment. What people are doing on the transgender issue, they are basically giving liposuction to an anorexic.
yeah,
That's what they're doing. Instead of saying, no, your mind is the problem, your body's just fine. We need to figure out a way to help change your mind.
yes,
And you treat that problem with psychiatry. You don't treat a psychological problem with surgery.
right.
But that's unfortunately the way many in our culture want to go.
Yeah, so the first thing I would say is if you go back to June in our church here at Arise, if you look it up on YouTube, we did a whole series called Pride and Prejudice, because it's Pride Month, and where we tackled quite a few of those different issues. I'll throw this out there too. September the 18th, Joe Dallas will be here, because you don't attend Arise, right? Or do
No.
you? Okay.
No, I live
Joe
in-
Dallas will be here if you want to come.
Okay.
He's a former homosexual activist who will be here speaking on that subject on the 18th
Okay.
of September. But going back to something I said earlier, the church polluted or the church popular is the church polluted, which is the church poor. Most pastors were very concerned with the church being popular, which is equated to attendance. We want attendance, and we'll do anything for attendance, instead of really making it about what it should be about and discipling people, as was said today. And so I think that plays out in our culture in such a way that churches won't talk on these subjects very often, which is the problem that we're talking about.
Yeah.
And so, but it's not just the church. The next step beyond the church is families and parents. You have got to be talking to your kids about this,
Yes.
and probably before you actually think they're ready.
Oh, yeah.
If you wait till you think, oh, now's the right time, you probably missed it by a year or two, just guessing.
Yes.
Because the stuff is, we all know it's on Disney and all this kind of stuff all the time, but those are actually, so this is, again, my opinion, but we're in this digital Babylon. It is a new world that's coming and here, and we have to train our kids to handle it. You are not going to protect them from all of it. It's not going to happen. It might happen for a season, but it's not going to happen long term. So what you have to do is teach them, just like if you went to be a missionary in India and you got to teach them the Hindu ways and how not to be a Hindu in India, you are going to have to teach them how to be a Christian within a secular environment, which is its own religion, which is the 4 pillars that Dr. Turek keeps referring to. Those are pillars of secular humanism. It's got its own religion unto itself. You have to train your kids how to respond to what's happening around them. And one of the ways you do that is through the different movies and mediums and things that come up. You have real open and honest conversations, teaching them apologetics and how to respond, what we believe, why we believe it. So you're actually creating a foundation so that all this shifting sand of culture, and you're the last question, so this might be a good place to start wrapping up. I have this fundamental belief that truth is becoming absent in our society. Whether you're talking about the news or fake news or whatever, people are grasping for truth. And nobody really knows what truth is anymore. Nobody, like, what can I trust? And everybody's grasping. The world that we live in is built on a foundation of shifting sand that will collapse. Give it time. It will collapse in front of us, in my opinion. I don't just mean like, I'm not talking about the nation. I just mean the cultural phenomenon we're having. It will collapse. And what will remain are those who have clung to actual truth. You have to teach your kids to cling to actual truth, because truth is about to become a commodity that will be very valuable. And your children and yourself will become valuable because you have something the culture wants, but they don't find anywhere else. And if you're not careful, we'll become the Christian that grasps onto everything, every little political whatever, and we grasp onto everything instead of holding to truth, what we believe, why we believe it, so that when it all shifts, people know who we are and where to go to. We're not changing like everybody else. So hold to truth. That's why we do apologetics. Know why you believe, what you believe, so that when people ask you why you believe what you believe, you have a good answer, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I like what you said earlier about love means you stand in the way of evil.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, we need to protect and we need to defend our children. And I think it's important that we teach them, guard your heart and guard your mind and guard your body.
That's right. In fact, that's the theme verse of tomorrow's talk is Proverbs 4:23. Above all else, guard your heart, because everything you do flows from it. It's exactly the opposite of the cultural message, which is follow your heart.
Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. Thanks for teaching, too.
That cultural message is pervasive. I've said this, everybody always gets a wow factor every time I say this, but there is a new gospel that is being presented within our secular culture. I'll share it with you real fast, because you've all seen it 1,000 times, but you didn't know what it was. So let me make up a hypothetical story that you've all seen on Lifetime TV. And you've all seen this movie, even though I'm making it up on the spot. I've done this a few times, and some of you have been in the setting when I've done it. So let me tell you what you've seen. The high school sweethearts are going to get married. They're graduating high school, or say college. He's a college baseball player, athlete, good boy, Farmville, USA, Smallville, USA. Good boy, done everything right. They're not sleeping together till they get married. They're the perfect little sweetheart couple. She's the same thing. She was the belle of the ball. She was the homecoming queen, whatever. And then she decides, as they're preparing to get married, that she wants to go and explore Europe and backpack through Europe for a few months, right? And you know, kind of check it out. It's what college kids do, right? So she leaves and goes to Europe. And while she's in Europe, she finds this new boy that's there. And this boy's different than good boy back home. He's a little wild, and he rides a motorcycle and wears a leather jacket, and he has a cool British accent and does things a little bit on the crazy side. And before she knows it, she finds herself jumping on the back of this motorcycle and riding off with this boy named Frank and riding across Europe. Meanwhile, good boy, fiance's back at home not realizing any of this is going on, but she's out here sowing her wild oats, and before you know it, she ends up sleeping with this guy, and all the restraints that she's had forever growing up of don't do this and do right, all of those have been lifted because now she's free. And so she goes off and she does her thing, and then she comes back home. And she's all conflicted. Have you all seen this movie? She comes back home and she's all conflicted Because Pete is the good boy. He's the baseball star. He's what the whole town says I should marry. And I know he's the good guy. But now I've experienced real freedom away from these restraints of society that want to oppress me. And I've experienced this real freedom. So what should I do? And so the day before the wedding or the day of the wedding, she's in the bridal chamber. She's talking to her mom. And she's like, Mom, I got to come clean. Let me tell you what I did. And Mom says, listen, I married your father, but I had this fling with this guy when I was in college. And I always wondered what would have happened if I had run off with Tony instead of marrying your father, and you should go. So she leaves Pete at the altar and gets on an airplane and flies all the way back to Europe and meets up and jumps on the back of the motorcycle with Frank and starts driving away. You've seen this story. Let me tell you what you just learned. The restraints of society are keeping you from your freedom. It is built into our society to hear this over and over and over. There is a new gospel message, and the gospel message is actually get away from anything that restrains you, such as church or morality. Get away from those things and live your own free life. The story never goes any further than that. The movie never goes to where they live happily ever after. Not really, because it's probably not going to end very well if you're in real life with that story. So it never really carries much further than that. But we've all heard that story in different ways. And that is the secular gospel that we're a part of. That's what your kids are growing up hearing all the time. It's the air we breathe. You cannot not be in it. So you have to prepare your children for that in order to be able to handle that.
So the moral of the story is never marry a Frank.
Well, friends, can we give it up for our panel and the questions that they took today?
Thanks for watching. Wasn't that an amazing message? We ask that you like and subscribe and share it on all your social platforms. We pray that that message left you feeling encouraged and inspired to take that extra step closer to Jesus. We'll see you next week.